September 12th, 2026. I pulled into my usual gas station this morning and couldn't believe what I was seeing. Regular unleaded, $2.15 per gallon. 6 months ago, I was paying $4.85 for the same gas. My neighbor Jim was already filling up his truck, grinning from ear to ear. Best news we've had in years, he said. Maybe things are finally getting back to normal. But here's what Jim doesn't know, and what millions of Americans celebrating cheap gas don't realize. This price collapse is not a return to normal. It's the calm before the storm. And the storm that is coming will make the energy crises of the 1970s look like a minor inconvenience. The reason gas prices crashed isn't improved American energy independence or successful government policy. It's because Venezuela just dumped 2.3 million barrels per day back into global markets after years of production collapse. That's like adding another Kuwait to world oil supply almost overnight. My friend Sarah, who analyzes energy markets for a living, put it perfectly. Everyone's celebrating cheap gas like it's permanent. But this is exactly what oil markets do before they explode upward. Temporary oversupply creates complacency right before supply shocks create crisis. We've seen this movie before, and it doesn't end well for consumers. What I discovered in my research is that we are witnessing the most dangerous phase of oil market cycles, the deceptive calm that makes everyone forget how quickly energy prices can destroy household budgets and crash entire economies. Understanding the Venezuelan supply shock. Venezuela's dramatic return to global oil markets represents the largest single supply addition since Saudi Arabia's capacity expansions in the 1980s, but the underlying dynamics make this surge temporary rather than sustainable. The numbers behind the collapse. Venezuelan oil production collapsed from 3.2 million barrels per day in 2013 to just 400,000 barrels per day by late 2024 due to sanctions, infrastructure decay, and political chaos. But the new China-Russia-India consortium agreement brought $47 billion in immediate infrastructure investment that restored production capacity faster than anyone anticipated. By August 2026, Venezuelan production had surged to 2.7 million barrels per day, an increase of 2.3 million barrels that flooded global markets with unexpected supply. To put this in perspective, that's equivalent to taking Iran's entire oil production offline, but in reverse, the market psychology. Oil traders operate on supply-demand mathematics, and sudden supply increases cause price crashes regardless of long-term sustainability. When Venezuelan oil hit markets in massive quantities, prices fell from 89 per barrel to 52 per barrel in 6 weeks. The fastest oil price decline since the COVID lockdowns. But experienced energy analysts recognize this pattern from previous cycles. Temporary oversupply creates euphoria among consumers while setting up the conditions for even more dramatic price increases when supply normalizes. The infrastructure reality. Venezuela. This oil surge is possible because existing infrastructure was restored rather than newly built. The consortium essentially reactivated production capacity that had been offline, creating a temporary supply boost that cannot be sustained indefinitely without massive additional investment. Current production rates are straining aging infrastructure that requires continuous maintenance and upgrading. Industry experts estimate that maintaining 2.7 million barrels per day production requires $8 to $12 billion annually in infrastructure investment. Funding that may not be available if oil prices remain below 70 per barrel. The political dynamics. The consortium agreement that enabled Venezuela's production surge was designed to serve Chinese, Russian, and Indian energy security rather than global price stability. If geopolitical tensions increase or consortium priorities change, Venezuelan production could be reduced rapidly regardless of global market impact. This political dependency makes Venezuelan supply inherently unstable compared to production from countries with long-term commitments to global market stability. Historical patterns. The deception of cheap oil. History provides clear examples of how temporary oil oversupply creates dangerous complacency that leaves consumers vulnerable to even more severe price shocks when supply conditions normalize. The 1986-1999 oil glut, Saudi Arabia. Its decision to defend market share rather than prices in 1986 created massive oversupply that drove oil below 20 per barrel for most of the 1990s. American consumers became accustomed to cheap gas while domestic oil production declined due to low prices, making many projects uneconomical. The cheap oil era ended abruptly in 1999 when OPEC resumed production discipline and Asian economic recovery increased demand. Oil prices rose from $12 in 1999 to $147 in 2008, over 1,000% in 9 years, because temporary oversupply had destroyed spare capacity and investment in new production. The 2014-2016 shale revolution. American shale oil production created temporary oversupply that crashed prices from 107 in 2014 to 26 in 2016. Consumers celebrated cheap gas while assuming shale production would provide permanent price stability, but low prices made many shale projects unprofitable, reducing drilling activity and future production capacity. When demand recovered and Venezuelan Iranian production declined due to sanctions, prices surged 150% in just 2 years because the supply buffer had disappeared. The COVID crash and recovery, 2020-2022, pandemic lockdowns created the largest oil demand destruction in history, driving prices briefly negative in April 2020. Many analysts predicted permanently lower oil prices due to remote work and reduced travel. Instead, rapid economic reopening combined with reduced investment during the crash created severe supply shortages. Gas prices rose from 2.17 per gallon in April 2020 to 5.01 in June 2022, 130% in 2 years, because temporary demand destruction had eliminated spare production capacity. The pattern. Every period of cheap oil creates the conditions for subsequent price explosions by reducing investment in new production capacity, creating consumer complacency about energy costs, eliminating spare capacity that provides price stability, making the economy more vulnerable to supply disruptions. The current Venezuelan supply surge is following this pattern exactly, creating temporary relief that masks growing vulnerability to future supply shocks. The infrastructure dependency trap. America's celebration of cheap Venezuelan gas masks a dangerous reality. Our energy infrastructure has become increasingly dependent on imports precisely when global supply chains are becoming less reliable. The refinery mismatch. Venezuelan crude is heavy, high-sulfur oil that can only be processed by specialized refineries designed for this type of feedstock. Most of these refineries are located on the U.S. Gulf Coast, making American gas prices directly dependent on Venezuelan supply stability and Gulf Coast refinery operations. If Venezuelan production declines or Gulf Coast refineries face operational problems, gas prices would spike regardless of global oil market conditions because the specialized infrastructure cannot be quickly replaced or substituted. The pipeline vulnerability. Venezuelan oil reaches American refineries through Caribbean shipping routes and pipeline systems that are vulnerable to weather, geopolitical tensions, and infrastructure failures. Hurricane seasons, political disputes, or technical problems can disrupt supply chains that millions of Americans now depend on for affordable gasoline. The Keystone XL pipeline cancellation and restrictions on domestic pipeline construction have made American refineries more dependent on imported oil transported through potentially unreliable systems, rather than secure domestic transportation networks. The strategic reserve depletion. The Biden administration released over 180 million barrels from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve during 2022-2024 to moderate gas prices, reducing America's emergency oil supplies to the lowest levels since the 1980s. Current cheap prices provide an opportunity to refill strategic reserves, but political pressure to maintain low consumer prices may prevent rebuilding the emergency supplies needed to handle future supply disruptions. The investment disincentive. Low oil prices reduce incentives for American energy companies to invest in domestic production capacity, making the country increasingly dependent on foreign supplies that may not be available during future crises. This creates a dangerous feedback loop where cheap imports reduce domestic investment, increasing import dependence that makes the economy more vulnerable to foreign supply disruptions. The coming supply shock mathematics. Mathematical analysis of global oil markets reveals that current low prices are creating the precise conditions that guarantee future price explosions of unprecedented magnitude. The investment collapse. Global oil and gas investment fell from $780 billion in 2014 to $315 billion in 2020 and has only partially recovered to $425 billion in 2025. This chronic underinvestment means future production capacity is inadequate to meet growing demand from emerging economies. The International Energy Agency estimates that maintaining current production levels requires $600 billion annually in upstream investment, but actual investment remains 30% below this level. The investment deficit is creating a supply crisis that will become apparent when Venezuelan oversupply normalizes. The depletion reality. Existing oil fields decline at rates of 6 to 8% annually, requiring continuous investment in new production to maintain global supply. With investment below replacement levels for over a decade, the underlying production base is shrinking while demand continues growing. Venezuela's temporary production surge masks this depletion crisis by providing short-term supply. But when Venezuelan production normalizes or declines, global supply shortfalls will become immediately apparent. The demand growth trajectory. Global oil demand is projected to reach 105 million barrels per day by 2030. Compared to current consumption of 102 million barrels per day. Most growth comes from Asia and Africa, where rising living standards increase energy consumption regardless of price levels. This 3 million barrel per day demand increase equals the entire production capacity of Kuwait or UAE. requiring massive new investment that isn't happening due to current low prices, creating investment disincentives. The geopolitical supply at risk. Current low prices depend on stable production from Russia, 10 million barrels per day, Iran, 3 million, Venezuela, 2.7 million, and other politically volatile producers. Any disruption to these supplies would remove 15 plus million barrels per day from global markets. Historical analysis shows that geopolitical supply disruptions typically remove 3 to 7% of global supply for 6 to 18 months, creating price spikes of 100 to 300% that devastate consumer budgets and economic growth. The timeline: how cheap gas becomes expensive. Gas based on oil market cycles, infrastructure constraints, and investment patterns. Here's how the current period of cheap gas will transition to crisis-level prices. Phase 1. Complacency period, September 2026, March 2027. Gas prices remain below $2.50 per gallon as Venezuelan supply surge continues and seasonal demand patterns favor consumers. Political leaders claim credit for affordable energy, while Americans increase driving and reduce energy conservation efforts. During this phase, domestic oil investment continues declining while import dependency increases, setting up future vulnerability to supply disruptions. Phase 2, supply normalization, April 2027, December 2027. Venezuelan production begins declining as infrastructure strains from increased output, while maintenance requirements and political pressures reduce consortium investment enthusiasm. Gas prices rise to $3.75 per gallon as Venezuelan supply surplus diminishes, but increases remain gradual enough to avoid widespread consumer concern. Phase 3, demand recovery impact, January 2028, August 2028. Asian economic growth and American economic expansion increase oil demand while reduced investment during the cheap oil period limit supply response capability. Gas prices reach $4.50, $5.25 per gallon, as markets recognize that supply growth cannot match demand growth, creating the first signs of structural tightness that indicate more severe shortages ahead. Phase 4, supply shock crisis, September 2028, ongoing. Geopolitical tensions, infrastructure failures, or natural disasters disrupt supply from major producers, while demand continues growing and spare capacity has been eliminated during the cheap oil period. Gas prices spike to $6.50, $8.50 per gallon, as supply shortages create panic buying and economic disruption that forces emergency government intervention and potential rationing systems. The economic destruction ahead. When oil prices inevitably surge from current artificial lows to crisis levels, the economic impact will be far more severe than previous energy shocks because the economy has become more energy dependent during the cheap gas period. The household budget. Impact. American families have adjusted their lifestyles around 2.15 gas by purchasing larger vehicles, moving farther from work, and increasing discretionary travel. When gas reaches $7+ per gallon, household budgets will face unprecedented pressure that forces dramatic lifestyle changes. The average American household consumes 650 gallons of gasoline annually. Price increases from $2.15 to $7 per gallon represent an additional $3,150 in annual energy costs, equivalent to a $3,000 tax increase on every household. The supply chain multiplier. Cheap gas has enabled expansion of supply chains that depend on low transportation costs. When fuel costs explode, shipping expenses will force supply chain reorganization that increases prices for food, manufactured goods, and services throughout the economy. Trucking companies, airlines, and shipping firms will face cost increases that must be passed through to consumers, creating inflation that extends far beyond direct energy costs and affects every aspect of economic life. The regional economic devastation. Rural and suburban communities that expanded during the cheap gas period will face severe economic stress when commuting costs become prohibitive and local businesses struggle with transportation expense increases. Rural America, which often requires longer commutes and has limited public transportation alternatives, will be disproportionately affected by energy price increases that make current settlement patterns economically unsustainable. The government budget crisis. State and federal governments will face massive increases in fuel costs for emergency services, military operations, and government vehicle fleets, while simultaneously dealing with economic disruption that reduces tax revenues. Emergency relief programs, transportation subsidies, and economic stimulus measures will strain government budgets already facing pressure from aging populations and infrastructure maintenance requirements. Preparing for the inevitable. Understanding that current cheap gas prices are temporary provides an opportunity to prepare for the price explosion that mathematical analysis shows is inevitable within 2 to 3 years. Individual preparation strategies. Americans should use the current cheap gas period to reduce their vulnerability to future energy price shocks through vehicle choices, housing decisions, and lifestyle adjustments that minimize energy dependence. This includes purchasing fuel-efficient vehicles, considering housing locations that reduce commuting requirements, and developing skills or business models that aren't dependent on cheap transportation. Investment implications. Current energy sector valuations reflect temporary oversupply conditions rather than long-term supply-demand fundamentals. Energy investments purchased during the current trough will likely provide exceptional returns when supply shortage reality becomes apparent to mainstream investors. But timing matters enormously because energy stocks can remain depressed during oversupply periods, even when fundamental shortages are developing beneath the surface of market consciousness. Business adaptation requirements. Companies should use the current period of cheap energy to reduce their vulnerability to future energy price shocks through efficiency improvements, supply chain optimization, and business model adjustments that maintain profitability even with high energy costs. Businesses that assume current cheap energy will continue indefinitely will face existential challenges when energy costs explode and force immediate operational changes during crisis conditions rather than gradual strategic adaptation. Policy recognition needs. Political leaders should recognize that current cheap gas provides temporary relief rather than permanent solution to energy challenges, requiring investment in domestic production capacity, infrastructure resilience, and emergency preparedness for future supply disruptions. The political temptation to claim credit for cheap gas while ignoring underlying vulnerability will leave the country unprepared for energy crises that could be mitigated through proper preparation during favorable conditions. The mathematics are clear, the historical patterns are consistent, and the warning signs are obvious. Current cheap gas prices represent the calm before the storm rather than permanent improvement in America's energy situation. Venezuelan supply surge has provided temporary relief that masks growing vulnerability to supply shocks that will create energy price explosions within 2 to 3 years. Those who recognize this pattern and prepare accordingly will weather the coming crisis successfully. Those who assume 2.15 gas represents permanent improvement will face devastating economic shock when reality reasserts itself and energy prices return to levels that reflect actual supply-demand fundamentals rather than temporary geopolitical arrangements. The great gas price deception is underway. The temporary relief is real, but so is the crisis that's building beneath the surface. Choose preparation over complacency, because the storm is coming whether we're ready or not.